Today, we're going to go over some things that can help your market be more welcoming to everybody in your community. And so today we have a couple of discussions. I believe Katie's going to go first. Oh, no, Tasha. Sorry. Tasha's going to go first today. Whenever we have the question and answers, we're going to save it till the end and then we'll pass around the microphone. We are streaming this one as well. And so we just want everybody to be able to hear. If you do have a question, we'll make sure to get the mic to you. Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? Good. Okay, I am a school teacher, so if you're not participating, I will pull you in. I am good at it. Got about 23 years experience. So, but just to be, more serious, my name is Latasha Timberlake. I am the executive director and founder of Lillian Timber Farms. I am a nonprofit 501c3 organization. And what we do is build community gardens throughout Northeast Oklahoma City. And we have also advanced to Spencer, Oklahoma. So I'm really excited about that. We also support other neighborhood associations and other organizations that have community gardens or have had community gardens that are dormant and wanting to get those up and going. We work with a plethora of organizations. So some of our highlights this year, we received a grant through the Oklahoma City Zoo. And so we are installing a pollinator garden for monarch butterflies at one of our local art middle schools. So I'm really excited about that. And then we've also had the opportunity to do more speaking engagements. So we're really looking forward to that as well this year. Today's topic is about creating intentional gathering spaces and inclusion, but I will warn you, some of the definitions I have changed from the traditional definition, just so that it makes sense for the context in which we're speaking. Work. Okay, I'll let that go and then I'll let you go. Yes. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to first talk about was when I think about the intentional gathering space. So for me, when I think about farmers markets, I'm a lot older than I may look, but I remember the farmer market being this very traditional place where farmers would come and sell their produce. And I remember, my grandmother waiting to get honey because, you had to get such and such as honey, and then you had to get such and such as eggs. But now when I think about farmers markets, I really think about this gathering space. I think about this space and opportunity where food is the catalyst for all of these other things to happen. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the landscape design of that. And when I'm talking about landscape design, I'm talking about the features of the market and if they are inclusive. And so I know a lot of times when we hear the word inclusivity or being inclusive, we automatically think about race and we think about gender. But I want us to stretch beyond that. And so when I'm really thinking about the landscape, I'm thinking about, does this space really include a spirit and a nature of, number one, people coming together? So it's like, if you go into a space and you're not feeling the vibe, you want to leave. So let's kind of think about the vibe. So when you think about, does the market have a vibe itself? You would know back in the day if a party was good or not when you walked in. So think about, so when you walk to the market, it's like, is the vibe, is the party going to be here? So really thinking about it in that aspect, but also thinking about what is it that I'm having to offer from the landscaping space. So when I walk in, what's going to catch my eye? And being very intentional with that, one small thing may be local produced flowers. Are they around in that space? Does somebody recognize a vendor that they may know? Does someone recognize a product that they're used to seeing or want to see? So when I talk about landscape, I'm not just talking about the land itself, but I'm really talking about the feeling. And how is that being inclusive of your audience? Because I don't want it to be where we think about customer driven, because these aren't customers. This is family. This is our community, right? Whether they are the people that are right there in our same community or a broader community that are driving to come out. I heard some ladies in the back talking about Durant, Oklahoma, and I was like, ooh, I want to drive out to Durant because I'm still an extension of your community because I'm in Oklahoma, or even if I was in Texas, I'm still an extension of your community because I want to be able to vend or buy things that are within the realm of being naturally produced or being locally produced or being produced by people that are like me. I want good food. I want to eat something that I know somebody has put some intentionality to, or this seed has been a family heirloom, right? And it continues to grow, or I've never seen a tomato, like that. And so then that takes me into the audience, and then what are we growing or selling? So that's a part of that same vibe. So I go in and I say, one of the things about Oklahoma City that you see is that culturally we have expanded, but do we really see that within the city? Am I able to go to my local market and find foods? One thing that I love about my life experience is that I've had the opportunity to live all over the world. And so there are some things that I want to see because I want to share them as an extension of my experiences and who I am with the people that I know, whether it is formally or casually. And so I want to be intentional when I'm working with people that whether we're growing it ourselves in our community gardens, or I found a friend that has some land and they're doing some big time farming, or I have a neighborhood association and I say, hey, have you all ever tried daikon? And they're like, what is that? And I'm like, oh, well, you know how you pickle the beets and stuff like that? Well, you can pickle daikon and it's really good. It has good iron, grows your nails and hair follicles. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, very easy to grow even in our same, land and our soil and stuff like that. So I also think about those things because for some cultures, that is a staple in the everyday foods. But what happens is that because we do not have enough cross-cultural interaction and awareness, a lot of us are missing out on a lot of good stuff. I think about the same thing with, if you look at this picture here, and this is one of our gardens here, who is it that is actually at the farmer's market? Because a lot of times what happens that I've seen in some of the markets, it's the same people that get locked in. It's really hard to just, number one, get in, and then number two, we really get the opportunity to miss out on some really good stuff. I've been knowing this old lady, you all, and I don't know who knows about cha-cha. If you ever heard about cha-cha. Okay. It's some goodness, okay? It is goodness in your life. But because of the way that we sometimes people don't know how to get things into a market and things like that, it's a great product. She's been making it for years, and she's getting old. And I'll talk a little bit about this later as part of sustainability, but it would be a great opportunity for her to get that displayed, maybe even teach some others. So when she's no longer here with us, like her legacy, right? And that legacy of community is able to live on through someone else, maybe impact someone else, right, to be able to produce that same product, and then that cycle continues. And so whomever she got her onions from and tomatoes from and peppers from, so now you have a plethora of people being impacted. Okay, so now I'm thinking about the sustainability piece. So I'm going to tell you my definition of sustainability is totally different. When I think of sustainability, I think about utilizing what we already have and being able to, number one, reproduce even more. Or number two, like one of the terms my friends that are in clothing, upscaling, right? So there's this term when we used to thrift all the time, and they'll be like, oh, these are hand me downs. Like, oh, baby, no, this is a hand me up. I'm gonna add a few new buttons on this, cuffs the sleeve. And so I really think about that in terms of our farmers markets as well. How do we keep it sustainable? How do we keep the farmers markets to be able to continuously grow? There has been this huge evolution. So like I said before, there was a time you came, people had their produce out there. Now you can use SNAP. Now you can use EBT. Um, you can even sometimes, get a plethora of whether it's food, non-food products, skin creams, soaps, all of those things. But what if you also had this space where people could come and join in a meal together? And it's like, oh, what did you get? Well, you get this, you get that, you get that, and then we're all going to share together. And then what if you brought in the arts? Right. So you have this opportunity where you have artists coming in. One of my greatest aspects is because I'm a plant person. Like I love all things plant, all things nature, is teaching painting through vegetables, using the hues of vegetables. So using turmeric, using beets, using, all these things that naturally bleed color, and how we actually get hues from that, and how we can create these things. So what if that is actually happening in the market? Because you see this 360-degree cycle of everything that started in the ground from this farmer or this gardener that planted this small seed. Or when we go back to sustainability, maybe it was already a tomato and then we kept those seeds and reused it. And so it had its own sustainability and rejuvenation. So taking that life cycle, but putting it to this tangible place. So we're not creating anything new. We're just using the natural and natural cycle of all things for something that we're going to be actively engaging with. And so that's what I think about sustainability. I think about how do we upcycle this process that we already have as being a farmer's market, and this shared space. So I have this space where I'm already bringing people together around food, and how can I expand that? How can I utilize it even more? I think about one of the ideas of, for the farmers markets, I know a lot of times it's like bring your own bag, right? But what if sometimes you even, you bring your own thing? I think a lot of times we don't get enough opportunities to share our own gifts. So it doesn't have to always be something that is planned. It could kind of be like this idea of open mic, right? But at the farmers market, and it's like, I may not be able to sing, but I do have this idea that I've done with knitting, and I'm, making socks for dogs. I have no idea, y'all. I'm just coming out. This is off the top of my head. But there is a slot of time within the market, and maybe you have people sign up, and I'm naturally sharing whatever that thing is that I have with my community. Because now it's not always about what is somebody selling, but what are we producing? And in production, we call that's cultivation. And it may be that, okay, she's a knitter and somebody may need something. And so you have this opportunity for the market to be even bigger, because now it's this place of being an expose for people that are within the community that no one ever knew about. Because not everyone is on social media. Not everyone is, Instagramming and Facebooking. And this is just the thing that they do. And they've never had a platform. So we have this opportunity through the markets to really be able to utilize it as that. And I chose this picture here because these buckets were donated to us. And I was like, how can I use these buckets, And so I had some seniors, and they were like, we really want to help in the garden, but girl, we can't get down that low. And so I said, I don't think I can either, but that's a really good idea. So then I saw something. I was like, oh, so I can get something built and put those buckets in there, and then they're already at waist level for them. And then what we did was I had them, well, then bring your own seeds, because I didn't have any money for seeds, but I can get y'all the buckets and the soil. And so then they brought their own seeds. And so that could be a type of programming too that you can offer. Maybe people don't have the opportunity to grow big scale, but they do want to support and offer. And they're like, well, I've been having these seeds. And so you may have an area where you can just drop off seeds, because Lily and Timber Farms will definitely take them, you know, and just that type of donor system, or thinking about, for me, sometimes I'm a singleton, so I live alone and different things like that. And so you can even have tables or areas where people can donate things, for examples. And I know sometimes we have to be careful now with COVID and things like that, but intentionally thinking about like coat drives and different things like that. So looking at the farmers market as this community space, not just a market anymore, but it's this opportunity for us to really create this opportunity for everyone to work together, or swap days, and I think about, in a sense of, we always think about money a lot of times, but sometimes we could have swap days, whereas like, I really need honey, but I only have eggs, so how about I give you these fresh eggs and then you give me that jar of honey, you know? Or, I've been knitting these socks for dogs. So how about I do these? Let's do some swapping here. But for me, I think that's really important, because what happens is you allow a lot of different people to get involved in a process that sometimes we feel like is just one way or one thing. And a lot of times when we think about numbers, a lot of people don't attend things, or a lot of groups feel like they are not a part of things because they don't see themselves there, or they don't really know how to interact with that, especially when they are specific to location. I have to be reminded of that too. It's like, oh, that's just something that they do, when it's really like it's something for everyone. And then a share board, or shared groups, even being intentional with reaching out to other groups and other people and say, hey, we are going to go to the market. I know for Lily and Timber Farms, I get a lot of emails about groups that want to be involved, or getting things, do volunteer time. And I know one of the things with markets is the cleanup part. And a lot of markets, especially those that are just beginning, because I know this even with my own organization, um, it's just a few people always doing all the work. And so I think we have a great opportunity to get a lot of different groups involved to say, hey, can your group come volunteer on the third Saturday to help with setup or cleanup? And even for vendors, because I think about me vending, I have these two big O's. I mean, the big igloos, then I got all my stuff, and then I got the tent thing on my back, and I'm trying to pull things. But, getting volunteers to come in and help and support that way, because that also helps people that want to be involved, but just really don't have the manpower to, help get things set up, get things broken down, especially a lot of our older community members that want to be involved and that we know need to get out and need some of the socialization. So being more intentional with that. So I think those are ways for being more sustainable and kind of upcycling our experience. And so lastly, because I know there are probably a lot of questions, I just kind of wanted to put out there a few of the community gardens that are around in the city. And I believe this will be on the app, so you'll be able to access these. So I try to get you to the correct website for each of these organizations. But any of you that may be managers, so just being intentional with reaching out to some of the community gardens. I know a lot of them would love to get connected to farmers markets. I know specifically for us, we don't sell our produce, but I would love to have an area at your market, if you want, for anyone that may not have the means and want free produce. So everything that we do is free. Um, but I think it's great to get them involved in some of the markets, because a lot of times the gardens are just standalone, or sometimes people think they're specific just for that community. Like the number one question I get from people is that anybody can just come And I'm like, yes, anybody can just come. And I know in our design, we were very intentional without having fencing because I didn't want anybody to feel like it was even restricted. So now the rabbits and I have another discussion about that. But but I would like to say that and even reaching out to them because they a lot of times they are connected to other farmers, especially when you're being intentional or wanting to have certain things being sold or being offered at your markets. A lot of the folks that are running these community gardens are like really people of the community, so they have a lot of resources and know a lot of people that are doing a lot of things that we may not be able to have access to because of social media, other things. And some people are just kind of low key, but they are definitely open to helping others. And that's all I have. You're welcome. Are there any questions? I'm on. He's gonna get me if I don't get this.
If my community does not have a community garden, who would I need to talk to about starting one, or can I just turn my property into a community garden?
So, where first of all, what county are you in? Because I don't. Okay, I'm not sure about Creek County. I can only speak for Oklahoma County. So, if you do have private, if it's a private lot that you own, you can do what you want to with it. So, our first lot, the Lottie lot, is actually owned by one of my good friends that I grew up with. And so we just turned it into a community garden. Now, we did have to get a permit for the, so we self water, but I wanted to add some stuff. So we did have to get a city permit to do that. But in terms of if you want to plan on it and allow people to come in, that is your choice. I'm not sure about that county because, but I know for Oklahoma County, we were fine. Yes. We do have liability insurance. Yes, we do. And I will say, from my understanding, the minimum is $1 million liability insurance. And I will say this too, since it came up, if you are ever looking to apply for grants, a lot of times some of the grants, especially those that are within the city or the state, they will ask for a minimum of you having $3 million, but do not let that deter you, because the only thing that I did was I just sent them a letter. Most entities that are just beginning, you're only going to be able to get $1 million policy anyway, and so they will grant that. So don't, it may say that, but just like, okay. And then just send them to show like this is usually what most people are only awarded. hmm You're welcome.
So Lisa Prescott from Creek County T-Sets here today. And so definitely look for her name tag. If I see her, I'll send her your way. You're welcome. Does anybody else have any more questions? All right. Thanks, Tasha. We appreciate you. And then up next is Casey. Katie? Oh, sorry. Oh, Katie. Sorry, it's Katie from the ONI Project.
Hello, my name is Katie Carlson. I am an intern with ONI, and I'm also a master's of public health student studying health education and promotion. My main goal is to eventually start designing health education and promotion programs that are specifically targeting people with disabilities. So as Latasha's presentation showed, farmers markets offer a really awesome opportunity to bring together diverse members of the community that might otherwise not really interact. And I think that it's also obviously a great opportunity for people to access healthy food. But today I want to talk about how we can improve that access for people with disabilities. So no, you're good. So before I start talking about accessibility, I want to be clear on what I mean by disability, because I think a lot of us have this kind of image that comes up when we hear the word disability. We probably think of like someone in a wheelchair or someone using a blindness cane. And those are certainly experiences that are valid. But they're not the only experiences. There can also be very invisible experiences that aren't necessarily encapsulated in those images. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on three main categories of people with disabilities. We're going to be focusing on people who use mobility aids. So that includes wheelchairs, crutches, walkers, etc. People who are blind or have low vision and who may or may not use a blindness cane, and people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so I also want to clarify what I mean by accessibility. Just like disability, accessibility encompasses a wide variety of experiences, both visible and invisible. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to define accessibility as allowing everyone in your market to be able to navigate the market as independently as possible or with minimal help from others. And that includes not just navigating the market, but also completing any relevant tasks, for instance, like purchasing items or exploring a booth and that sort of thing. I also just want to say that a lot of the information from these slides came from a variety of sources, including ADA guidelines, blog posts from people with disabilities, conversations I've had with market managers, and also some really awesome resources from the Oklahoma Office of Disability Concerns, which they are a really great resource that I think everyone should know about. And certainly a good point of contact to keep in mind for any sort of questions around accessibility and especially specific to your market. Oh, the Oklahoma Office of Disability Concerns. Yeah, no problem. Oh, could you go back for a second? No, you're fine. So all of that being said, you might find that some of the sort of guidance that I give today just doesn't really apply to your market, or maybe it just isn't feasible right now, and that's okay. Just kind of think of this as a starting point to start thinking about disability and accessibility, and don't expect to necessarily come away with all of the answers today. And it's just meant to kind of be like the start of an ongoing learning process. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about before we get into specific accessibility aspects is the benefits of starting to consider this topic. So there's the most obvious benefit, which is you're showing that you value diversity. You're showing your community members that you care and that you want to act on these values. And people with and without disabilities will appreciate seeing that. You're also opening up a new potential customer base. So a lot of people with disabilities assume that places that are temporary setups like a farmer's market isn't going to be accessible. But if you start showing that you're willing to try and that you're advertising changes that you're willing to make, you're really opening yourself up to not only a new customer base, but a relatively loyal one. People with disabilities tend to be very loyal to places that they can access because those places can be so rare. And they also tend to then talk about those places with other people in their community. And so it's just sort of the word of mouth can be really powerful for this specific community. And then on top of that, you're also benefiting all the rest of your customers. You're probably going to find that a lot of the tips I give really make it easier for everyone to navigate your farmer's market. And in addition to that, everyone's going to benefit if you have a more diverse space where you're able to meet new people that you wouldn't meet otherwise. You can go to the next one. All right, so we're going to kind of walk through the process of getting to a farmer's market, navigating the space, purchasing items. And as we do this, try to kind of put yourself in this mindset of you're doing all of this at your market. You have maybe a mobility aid, you might have hearing loss, vision loss, and just try to like think of ways in which your market maybe has some barriers and maybe also ways in which you're already improving accessibility, either intentionally or unintentionally. So a customer's experience is going to start with finding parking, which may seem simple, but it's not as simple for everyone, especially for someone who uses a mobility aid. Accessible parking can be the difference between entering a space and being completely cut off from that space. In general, accessible parking should be as level as possible, have access to an accessible pathway to the entrance. It should have accessible parking spaces that are close to the entrance as well. And your farmer's market might already have accessible parking depending on where it's set up. But if it doesn't, there are some temporary solutions, one of which is to set aside 2 parking spaces, which is demonstrated on the right of this slide. So one acts as the parking space, and then the other space acts as the access aisle. So an access aisle allows space for car doors to open and van lifts to operate. The access aisle combined with the parking space should be 16 feet wide. That allows for a van to park and be able to operate. You can also extend this so that you have 3 parking spaces, 2 of which are for parking, and then the middle is a shared access aisle. This solution can also work if you don't necessarily have clearly marked parking spaces, as long as you use similar dimensions. So in this situation, you would want to block off the access aisle so no one tries to park there, and then have a temporary accessible parking sign marking the space. And regardless of whether your accessible parking is temporary or permanent, it's really important to have directional signage. An example is shown on the left of this slide. Directional signage tells people where the accessible parking is, and it can also, depending on where it's placed, kind of act as a form of advertising accessibility to passerbys who may not otherwise try to visit your market. Another important aspect is to make sure you don't have signs or other items blocking curb cuts or the entrance, or the path to the entrance, sorry. And you might also need a temporary ramp if you have curbs, but you don't have curb cuts. So a temporary ramp should be at least 3 feet wide or 36 inches wide. It should be able to hold a minimum of 600 pounds, and it should have a slope no more than 1 to 12. So the slope is the height of the curb divided by the distance from the bottom of the curb to the start of the ramp, which I know can be kind of confusing, but that's another thing that a lot of these dimensions and numbers can kind of confusing, but I have included some links at the end of the presentation for some really awesome guides for temporary events and ADA guidelines for small businesses. So don't worry about trying to remember all of the small details. And then the other big thing, like I said, you don't want to have signs blocking curb cuts. That's a common issue at temporary events. And then once someone has parked, they need to actually get to the entrance. So not everyone with a disability is going to park in accessible parking, especially for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing. It's really important that you clearly mark the entrance and maybe have some directional signage along the way if your parking is far. And then once someone reaches the entrance, if maybe your market is indoors part-time, there might be a door that they have to open. So ideally the door should have a lever handle rather than a doorknob. It makes it easier for someone with a mobility aid to open. And then if maybe you're in an older building or something, it's kind of narrow, you can install swing clear hinges, which usually add about 2 inches of clearance. And those can be really helpful for someone using like a walker or wheelchair to get through. I think that's it. You can go to the next one. Thank you. So these are just a couple examples of temporary curb ramps. And as I said before, they should be 3 feet wide. They should be able to support 600 pounds minimum. And they should also have high curbs so that someone doesn't fall off when they're using it. And then the start of the curb shouldn't be higher than 1/4 of an inch. And these types of temporary ramps can be purchased pre-made, or you can design them on your own using something like a rubber mat and plywood. And you can go to the next one. Okay. So once someone has entered your market, they need to be able to navigate and move around as easily as possible. So kind of think about the layout of your market and how someone who is using a mobility aid might need more room to move around. You might also have to consider the fact that your market can get pretty busy, so there might be lines at certain vendors. One idea is to place busy vendors around the edges of the venue so that the lines aren't blocking the paths between vendors. And of course, people are going to need different amounts of space. So it's usually a good rule to plan around those who need the most space. Usually the guidance is to have at least 3 feet wide aisles. And again, depending on how busy it is, you might want even more space than that. You also want to make sure there aren't items left on the ground that can be a trip hazard or block the path for someone using mobility aid. Oh, did you have a question? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question was how many accessible spaces would be recommended. So there is guidance on technically to be ADA compliant. I think it's something like for every 50 spaces, you should have 2 accessible spaces. Um, I believe that that's right, but obviously I'm not going to say that I know for sure. Um, Personally, I think it would be awesome to try to make 2 accessible spaces with a shared access aisle, because chances are you will have more than one person needing that space. But yeah, more spaces are always better. And I know it also obviously depends on your parking lot and the room that you have, but if possible, 2 is always great because 1 is kind of not really a safe number because if anyone's using it, then no one else can really have that space. Yeah, but that's an awesome question. Yes. Mhm. Oh, I see what you're saying. So the question was if I've ever seen like spaces being constantly used to where they're running out of room. I honestly haven't had enough experience seeing that situation and being at farmers markets in Oklahoma enough to answer that question, I don't think. Sorry. Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely do. It's certainly an issue at our farmers market. I think that because we have kind of parking, we have very limited spaces available for wheelchair accessible walking aid parking. We see a pretty recurring need for more spaces. So I think that erring on the side of looking for allocating too many spaces is going to be a safer bet than depending on your space, obviously, like Katie was saying. But I think that you're only going to get good results. And I think having to scale back would be a better than, continuing to, okay, we've got to upscale, we've got to upscale. So yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you so much. And also, if that is something that, as you're kind of talking with other markets and you're finding it's a recurring issue, you might want to reach out to, for instance, the Office of Disability Concerns. And I'm sure that they would be able to kind of help you come up with that temporary solution. Because I know it's also hard since you're not always there. It's different than setting up like a store that's permanently in that space. Um, so this slide is, oh, was it? Can you go back just for a second? Sorry. Oh, right. Yeah. So the other thing that you want to be, the other thing that helps people navigate your markets more easily is going to be signage. So it can be really helpful to have signs that are marking amenities like restrooms or like any sort of seating area that you have, and you want to make sure that they can be seen above a crowd. This is especially important for deaf or hard of hearing customers because visual communication really helps when you can't necessarily, it's harder to ask someone for directions somewhere. Another thing that can help your customers is having some sort of seating area to rest. A lot of people, even if they don't necessarily have a visible disability, might be fatigued from standing for long periods of time. So having that seating area can be really valuable and encourage people to spend more time at your markets. And if you decide to do that, you do want to make sure you have a space for someone in a wheelchair to park and rest as well. And especially for your older customers, you might find it helpful to have some sort of setup where they have a cart or a wagon to carry their items, or even consider recruiting volunteers to help people carry items to their car, or even just to help people navigate the market if they would like a volunteer to help them with that. I think you got this. Okay, so 2 other really important aspects to consider when you're setting up are trip hazards and protrusions. So trip hazards are a change in elevation greater than 1/4 of an inch is considered a trip hazard. So if that change in elevation, it might be due to something like the surface material changing. If it can't be eliminated, which oftentimes it can't, and the change is less than 1/2 an inch, then you can use a bevel, which is pictured right here, and it should have a slope of no more than 1 to 2. So this helps the change in elevation be more gradual. So someone has less of a chance of tripping if they can't see, or if they're in a wheelchair, they can more easily go past the change in elevation. The other aspect is protrusions. So protrusions are objects that are coming from some sort of surface. So it might be like a wall, it might be a tent that's set up. And ideally, you don't want to have any protrusions that are more than 4 inches. If you do have protrusions that are more than 4 inches, you want them to be high enough that someone isn't going to run into it, or low enough that it can be detected with a cane. And the dimensions for that are usually 80 inches of vertical clearance. And then if it's lower to the ground, you want it to start no higher than 27 inches above the ground. If that is absolutely not possible and you can't eliminate the protrusion, then try to put something under it so that someone could detect it with a cane instead of running into it. And then this diagram kind of shows those measurements and the safe dimensions of protrusion so that someone who's blind or has low vision isn't bumping into objects. And again, there is a PDF of this on Whova, so you can reference that later if you need to. All right. So once a customer reaches an individual vendor, there's a lot of little details that can help make the experience more dignified for them. For example, try to make sure that tables aren't more than 3 feet tall to allow someone who's in a wheelchair to browse all the available items. If that isn't possible, then vendors need to be prepared to offer assistance if someone needs it. Another aspect that's really important is the signage that vendors use to mark their items. So oftentimes I've visited a few markets and oftentimes people will use handwritten signs, which can be like very visually attractive, but not always easy to read. And especially for people who are blind or have low vision, it's really important that they're able to easily tell what the sign is indicating. So placing the sign close to the item that it's indicating. Preferably having typed signs using a font like Helvetica, Calibri, Comic Sans, not using fonts that are script, italic, extended, light. Those are all usually a lot harder to read. And if a sign, and also having it be bolded is really helpful and at least 22-point font. If a sign is handwritten, it's really important to not have all the words crammed together. And again, to not use script because it makes it really hard to tell the letters apart and letters and numbers apart, which is especially not helpful if you have pricing and all of that on there. The other thing to keep in mind is that people with disabilities might need more time for completing certain tasks like making a purchase. Someone who's blind might be using a money counter, or they might need a vendor to read prompts out loud if there's a card reader involved. Okay. So to help better serve customers who are blind or have low vision, it can be really good to be familiar with different types of blindness canes. So a lot of us are probably most familiar with all white canes, like the one on the left. These typically indicate that someone is completely blind, so they don't have any usable vision. The one in the middle is white with a red stripe at the bottom. These usually indicate that someone has some amount of usable vision. So maybe they have central vision loss due to macular degeneration, or they just have some level of low vision. The one on the right is red and white striped. These indicate someone is deaf-blind. So that doesn't mean that someone's 100% deaf or 100% blind. It just means they have some level of vision loss and some level of hearing loss. And there's also different types of canes. So there's guide canes, which someone will hold in front of them just to indicate that they have a level of vision loss. They're not used to detect obstacles or anything like that. And they're usually used in busy spaces. So you might actually see those at farmers markets. There's also guide canes and long canes. So guide canes are a little shorter. They're used to detect things like stairs or curbs. And then long canes, usually those extend like 2 feet in front of someone. So they do require more space and they're considered a mobility tool. So it can let someone be a lot more independent than the other types. And all of those types of canes can have color coding on them. But also someone might not use a cane that corresponds with that. So this isn't going to be helpful 100% of the time, but it might help you in specific situations. Okay. So these are just kind of the basics of helping you interact with people who have disabilities. It's important, of course, to demonstrate respect. So simple things like not touching someone's mobility aid or blindness cane without their permission, and speaking at a regular volume to someone who's deaf or hard of hearing. It's also really important to not distract service animals, to make sure you're showing patience if they need more time to communicate. And also for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, they might prefer to communicate via writing. So you might want to encourage your vendors to have like pen and paper ready, or a clipboard ready, so that someone who is in a wheelchair and needs to sign something is able to do that. It's also important to advertise the accessibility that you do have so that people know, because otherwise they may never realize and they may never try to enter your market. You can do so maybe on your website or social media, and it's really good idea to keep a point of contact for them so that they can reach out if they have any specific accessibility concerns. And this is more likely to give them more confidence when they do come to visit your market. So as I said at the beginning, this isn't meant to be an all-encompassing presentation, it's just sort of a starting point to get you to start thinking about disability and accessibility. And it's really important to be open to changes. It can be kind of intimidating to take on a bunch of changes at once, which is okay. But make sure you talk with people that you see who may need more accessibility options and ask them what you can do to improve things, and talk with other market managers to come up with ideas for addressing those concerns. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Oh, sorry. So I'm also working on a guide to give people accessibility ideas for farmers markets that's going to be included with OLAC, you said, right?